This webcast and any accompanying materials are copyrighted by the American Association for Respiratory Care. Any public display, sale, copy, or distribution of the video or materials may only be undertaken with the prior written consent of the AARC. Copyright 2015, all rights reserved. My name is Shauna Strickland. I am a respiratory therapist, asthma educator, and Associate Executive Director of Education at the AARC. I welcome you to today's presentation, Helping Your Medically Complex Patients Become Disaster Ready. Upon completion of this AARC webcast, participants will be able to define a disaster, describe the meaning of disaster ready, describe the unique needs of pulmonary patients, and describe the role a respiratory therapist can fill in disaster readiness. I am pleased to welcome Charlie Friderici. He is a registered respiratory therapist and paramedic and the emergency management specialist at St. Peter's Health Partners in Albany, New York. Charlie is also the chair for the AARC Disaster Response Roundtable. I disclose that I am a paid employee of the American Association for Respiratory Care. Charlie declares no conflict of interest. Charlie, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Welcome, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which coast you're on. And I'm unfortunately in the group of people that's below 50 degrees. I think it's 47, so that's a lot better than it's been around here. So we'll just start right in here, and we'll talk about what is a disaster. And on the slide in front of you, you see several different definitions, which I took from various locations. And you can, if you do spend a little bit of time reading them, you realize that they're a little bit different, and maybe there's not any defined definition of what a disaster is. Whoops, there we go. What I said is there's many definitions, not so much a real consensus, but there is a common thread. And that common thread is the disruption of daily life. It's also an event that exceeds an area's ability to cope with that disruption in daily life, whether it's a large incident or a small incident. And I put up there, we know what one is when we see one. I took that from another definition of something else altogether. When you take a look at that picture, which is Hurricane Irene from 2011, it's pretty obvious that that's a large incident. That's a big disaster. And it's one that hit our particular area here in New York pretty hard, as well as many other areas very hard. And that's an obvious picture of a disaster. We look at some other pictures here, some photos of disasters: flooding, earthquakes, wildfires, tornadoes. I tried to include things that happen throughout the United States. And a couple of pictures there of Boston from 1978 and then again from this year. And I tried to include a picture of Buffalo, but it's just more snow. I mean, that's all it is. So most disasters, most of the things that we think about and worry about are natural disasters. And that's a lot of what we plan for in hospitals and at home and anywhere. But there's also other types of disasters that or events that we can have happen that we would consider a disaster. One of the more recent issues that's coming up is cyber attacks. That group Anonymous that goes through and does denial of service attacks on utilities and on websites. That's a big concern, and it's a growing concern for us. Other things that we worry about and think about are things like the blackout. That's a picture there of the Northeast blackout from a few years ago. Bombings, terrorist activity, bad guys doing bad things. And then disease. In the middle there you see our new friend Ebola. and the MERS-CoV virus, as well as influenza. All of those things have the potential to be a disastrous event. But especially when you're dealing with pulmonary patients or any patients or yourself, and an event doesn't have to be of the scale of a Hurricane Irene to have an impact for you, to disrupt your daily life, and to affect your ability to deal with it. Taking a look here, you see some trees down, some wires down, and that doesn't look all that bad. But think about this. If you were a patient on a ventilator at home and the power went out, you would want to have some sort of preparation for that. Excuse me. And if that power was going to be out for 12 hours or 24 hours or 48 hours, now that becomes, while not a disaster, that becomes a disaster for you, and that becomes an event that you need to worry about. So as RTs, we're used to advocating for our patients. We advocate for them with their therapy in the hospital. We advocate for them when we're home care therapists and they need better care or improved care or more efficient care. But we're also in a pretty unique position too. We know what COPD does. We know, and other lung diseases as well, we know that these folks have special needs, and no matter where we work, we're in a position that we're aware of those special needs. You haven't had to be in the field for very long to know that respiratory therapists are getting more and more involved in the continuum of care, not just taking care of the patient when they're in, but working on their discharge instructions, working on their home care, working on their follow-up to make sure that their treatment is appropriate. And as part of that, it stands to reason that we can help them get prepared for some sort of potential emergency that could happen to them. I'm a hospital therapist by trade. I worked in hospitals at the bedside for 18 or 19 years before I took on this role. And I have to say that in that, my knowledge of what really is needed at home was kind of lacking. So this was helpful in order for me to learn a little bit more about what's needed. So you send somebody on oxygen home. And most places, most hospitals are going to deal with a home care company or an oxygen company. But what you have to keep in mind is that concentrators, they need electricity to run. Well, that seems very simple to us. We're used to that. To somebody going home where the power goes out maybe once a week, that could be an issue. If they have liquid systems or any kind of system, it needs to have a backup. You need to have a plan to get liquid systems refilled. And if you're on oxygen at home, generators, backup cylinders, batteries, if the equipment will run off of batteries, are all important things that, even though the home care company has that responsibility, it's a good thing to reinforce with your patients when you're talking to them about discharge, especially if you're in an area that's prone to natural hazards, if you're in the Midwest where there's tornadoes or earthquakes out in California. It's important to make sure that your patients have a good contact list for information, or information list for their oxygen company, and work with that company and your patient to find out if there are registries in your local area, either through emergency management, through your local fire departments, or the power companies. Most power companies will restore medical patients' electricity on a higher priority basis than just the regular person. More special needs is medications. Patients are on a wide variety of medications, oftentimes many medications all at once. What concerns us, though, I think a lot of times is the inhaled medications. If people have nebulizers at home which need electricity to work, perhaps, or gas in order to work. Some of the medications may need refrigeration, not just the respiratory medications, but any of the medications. As people get older and have more medical problems, maybe they are diabetic and they need to have insulin refrigerated or other medications. When you're talking with your patients, it's a good thing to reinforce to them that they should keep at least a 3-day supply of medications in place. And I suggest even a week's supply. Sometimes that's a little difficult to work with a pharmacy to get a week ahead, but it's worthwhile, especially if you're in an area which is prone to events, which is prone to disasters. Because your patient may be stuck in home, they may have to evacuate, they may have to go to a stranger's house or something like that, and medications is really going to be the last thing that they want to think about. So make sure that they're prepared for that ahead of time. People on ventilators that use CPAP or other types of devices, vests, anything that plugs into electric, obviously normally powered by electricity. Most of the home ventilators have some sort of an integrated backup, not all though, and those that do may have a limited backup time. It might be a few hours, might be an hour or so, maybe as long as a day. Depends on how robust that backup system is. But these patients may also be on oxygen. And other devices such as BiPAPs and CPAPs don't necessarily have a battery backup. So it's important for these folks to have a plan in place, whether it's generators, whether it's uninterruptible power supplies, or early evacuation to another place, to a shelter that might have utilities all the time. Patients, again, should verify the emergency contact information for their home care agency or company, and as well notify utility companies and emergency services to place them on a registry so that they will get early restoration in case a power goes out or natural gas service or anything else. The last thing I'm going to mention about special needs, and there's many, is mobility issues. And we all know, think of the COPD patient that's fairly ill. They can't walk too fast. Typically, they can't walk too far. So if they've got to evacuate, if they've got to move out, that ability for them to get from point A to point B may be limited. They may need assistance with their oxygen setups, machines, ventilators, or BiPAP or CPAP machines, medications, just in general type equipment. They're going to require a special needs type of sheltering or medical sheltering. And the special needs shelter is really different. It's different than your regular Red Cross shelter. What we mean by that when we talk about a special needs shelter is somewhere that has the ability to provide electricity for these folks, to provide oxygen, to provide areas that they can store and deliver medication, and in many cases to provide assistance, to provide whether nurses or other healthcare people to help these patients survive being in the shelter. It's a very different type of setup than what you would think of a regular Red Cross shelter, which would be a tent somewhere or something along those lines. Oftentimes, depending on where you are and what kind of events could happen to you, really a lot of the safest place to be is at home. But for many people, if they're in a flood zone or they're in a tornado area, it may be worth their while, and it might be worth in your discussion with them to talk about moving out earlier, to evacuate earlier than, say, you or I might do. Because it's going to take these people a little bit longer to move, it's going to take patients a little bit more difficult time to get from, say, even 3-4 miles down the road to a local medical shelter. So it's something to consider, especially with events that have notice. Things like tornadoes we don't necessarily have a notice about. But right now we're concerned here in the Northeast about flooding because we've got a couple feet of ice on our rivers and the snow is finally melting. So our concern is if we get a big rainstorm, are we going to have flooding? And usually we know that ahead of time. So we would be able to move people out and move them into a shelter ahead of any floodwaters, so we don't have to do it when they can't move quickly. And a big consideration with any of this is it safer to just stay home? Is it safer to shelter in place? Many times, especially even in the aftermath of a bad storm like a tornado or a bad thunderstorm, even without power, you may be safer in your house than trying to wander about with down power lines and gas leaks and things of that nature. So those are the special needs of pulmonary patients. It's probably not all of them, but I think it begins to give you a picture of what is a little bit different for those folks than what it might be for you or I, especially in terms of, you know, oxygen or needing a ventilator, needing to bring that with you, wheelchairs, any of that sort of stuff. So to be disaster ready, we'll move on to the next part of the topic here, really is a matter of being informed, making a plan, building a kit, and getting involved. Being aware and taking action to prepare for disasters or events before they happen. And I use the word disaster kind of back and forth because, again, when you think of the word disaster, you think maybe Hurricane Irene. But in reality, we're talking about events. We're talking about things that may be localized that may not rise to the level of a disaster, but yet people are going to need extra help. There may be issues with transportation, with electricity, with water, any of the utilities. The things that make our life a regular life may not be there. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about emergency management stuff. There's actually 5 phases of emergency management. Unless you're a Joint Commission surveyor, then there's 4 phases of emergency management. And they're listed there: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And there's a nice little arrow diagram there. But in reality, you could almost kind of take these and mix them up and put them in almost any order you want, because all of these kind of meld together. I think of it like an ink blot. Why, yes, there's certainly, you're not going to respond to something until it happens. But the things that are happening ahead of time, the prevention, the protection, mitigation, which is looking at, let's say, here's an example of mitigation. You have people that live in a flood zone, elevating their houses so that the basement doesn't fill up with water. That could be a mitigation strategy. Doing those things before the response makes that response smoother. Having that plan ahead of time makes the response smoother. And in reality, when you're planning for a response, you're also planning for recovery. You're planning to take care of the situation as it's happening, but you're also planning on taking care of how do we fix this for later on. How do we get back to normal? How do we get houses rebuilt? How do we get streets rebuilt and electricity put back on? And in doing so, you may go backwards into that mitigation phase and say, what could we do differently so that the houses don't wash away? Well, let's move them up the hill, or let's bury the electric wires underground so that they don't fall down, things of that nature. So if you look at that as a cycle, that's a good way to look at it. But if you also kind of look at it as an ever-moving cycle, that each phase of that depends on the success of the phase before it and potentially after it. Maybe that's a little confusing, but just think of that ink blot and all of this stuff in some ways happening all at once. So getting ready, that really means being prepared. And this applies when you're talking to your patients, but it also applies to you, to us, to all of us, to be ready for whatever hazards are going to happen in your area. And really the first thing here is to be informed. Know what's going to affect your area. Now when I plan for things, I don't plan for earthquakes. And we have them, but they're not big. But people that would be in my job in California, or you folks that are in California, the earth may be shaking right now. It's something that you deal with on a regular basis. I would have never thought I'd be dealing with planning for a hurricane and a tropical storm, and 2 years in a row we dealt with just those things. So for us as caregivers, for emergency people, for just regular people living our lives, and for our patients, it's important to know the natural hazards, the man-made hazards. When I think of man-made hazards, I think of how close do you live to a railroad yard? Is there an interstate highway running back through your backyard? Things like that. If you flip over a tank truck, is that going to leak out stuff and make you have to move? Part of being informed is paying attention to the weather, paying attention and knowing the difference between a weather warning and a weather watch. Knowing what your local resources are. There's some counties out there that have just absolutely amazing preparedness programs for not only their special needs people, but for everybody. And with checklists and information about where shelters are and how to get there and what the plans are. And of course, radio, TV, and our friend the internet are all ways to learn about and find out and know what's going to happen. And you need to make a plan. And the plan itself is not what's really important, it's the planning that's really important. And that was a concept that Eisenhower went with all the time. It's really important to have a communications plan, some way of letting people know that you need help, letting people know where you are, letting people know what's being affected, and also that people can get a hold of you. The telephones, cell phones, internet, SMS, which is text messaging. ICE is in case of emergency. Most new cell phones have an app or a button on there that you can say, in case of emergency, contact all these people if somebody finds you or finds your phone. Having this all ahead of time, numbers of 911 or numbers of where a shelter is, or any of that stuff ahead of time is better than trying to muddle through when stuff is happening. You should have a plan to shelter in place. Again, this is not just for patients, but it's for all of us. How am I going to stay here? How long can I stay here? Can I stay for 1 day or 2 days or 3 days, and then I've got to say uncle and get out? Or do I have enough stuff that I could stay for a week and be happy without electricity? I would say most patients that have medical needs probably wouldn't be able to shelter for very long, so they would think about evacuation. It's imperative to know ahead of time where you're going to go if you have to evacuate. What's the route you're going to take? Are you in a tornado zone where there's tornado sirens, or in a hurricane area where there's hurricane warnings and sirens and signs and routes and everything ahead of time. And just where are those shelters? We talked about special needs. In either of these two issues, the shelter-in-place or evacuation, we're talking about either for short-term or potentially long-term, depending on the scope of the situation. Building a kit is one of those things that is not just for doomsday preppers anymore. It's really for everybody. As we learned in some earlier disasters, it takes the federal government sometimes 48 hours or longer to get on scene. While they're doing and working towards doing a better job by pre-positioning assets and things like that, it still might be a day for somebody to get reached in a more rural area. So it's important to have a kit available, to have stuff that you need to survive. Bottled water is number one. You can go a long time without food, but not so much without water. And the minimum is a gallon per person per day, and for a minimum of 3 days. Canned or non-perishable food. Got some pictures over there on the right-hand side of that of Spam. I think there's still Spam from 1942 out there, and it's probably just as bad as it is now, unless you like it. Peanut butter, things like that that don't necessarily go bad. If you've got canned food, can opener, that's important. It's awfully hard to do that if the power's out and that's all you have is an electric can opener. We already talked about medications. At least 3 days worth. I personally keep 7 days worth and just rotate it all the time. Battery operated radio, flashlights, batteries, personal supplies, things that you would need, toilet paper and toothbrush and that kind of thing. And then cash, because if the power's out, ATMs aren't going to work. So you should keep a certain stash of cash with you. It doesn't have to be $1 million, but enough to buy extra stuff, enough just to buy things if necessary. And then if you're a patient, if you are advising a patient, they should have in their kits extra oxygen, mobility type items, any of their special needs that they might need to have. And a lot of people have a home kit and a work kit. A lot of people put one together for driving, especially in the wintertime. There's some great resources from FEMA, and the link is later on, but it's FEMA.gov. And they list a very robust listing of what you should have as far as having a kit and putting it together. And you know, it's not something that you have to buy all at once. You know, you look at this and you say, boy, if I got, you know, a flashlight and radios and batteries and food and everything else, and it's going to cost me $1,000. No, it doesn't have to. You know, if you go to the store, or your patient goes to the store, or somebody goes there, and you pick up a 6-pack of water, case of water, and you just keep it there, and then you just replenish it as you go. You buy, you know, a box of batteries or a container, a little cart of batteries when you go to the hardware store, so that you can start to build this stuff up and then rotate it through, because even Spam does go bad after a certain amount of time. I'd like to talk about getting involved. And just by being here, I see over 350 people here, so that's great. You are getting involved. You're here, you're interested, hopefully you're learning something. And there are ways that you as RTs can help promote preparedness in your community, with your patients, and with your families. First of all, at work, every facility has to have some sort of an emergency plan, whether it's called a disaster plan or an emergency management plan or a response plan. Every place has one, and has to. Even if you work in home care or you work not in the traditional hospital setting, there's plans there. And as RTs, we bring a unique perspective to the planning process. We know about things like oxygen. We know about consumption of oxygen and how long it lasts. We know what's necessary to keep a ventilator running. We know about all of the stuff that respiratory therapists know. And we can bring that to the table at your emergency preparedness committee at your facility. So the questions to ask yourself is, where is the plan? Is it on the internet or intranet? Is it in a big dusty book that nobody's ever seen? If that's the case, it's worth blowing it off and taking a look at it. Find out, what is your role in a disaster, whether you're at work or at home? What are your expectations to respond or to stay home, or whatever that case may be? And when there's drills, when there's exercises, participating in them is really the best way to learn all about how your plans work and whether they're worth the paper they're written on, quite frankly. Because if you don't test them out, and if you don't try them out, and you don't make the phone calls that are on your telephone list to call the utility and say, we need to get power restored here, those plans really aren't any good unless you try them out. Think about, in your facilities, really you're talking about, how do you keep your patients safe, and how do you keep your coworkers safe? There's other ways you can get involved. MRC is Medical Reserve Corps, and that's typically a volunteer organization, and they're throughout all 50 states. They may be called something a little bit different. And what that is volunteer organization of clinical, mostly, and some non-clinical people. It may be retired people. It may be people that are nurses that have moved on to a different career, or therapists. But they're always looking for people. They're always looking for help. And many of the MRCs are very active in countywide and statewide drills. Here in New York, one of our local health department drill deliverables is a pod drill, point of dispensing. So we're using our Medical Reserve Corps to staff the drills, to staff the points of dispensing. And it can be a good way to network with people that are interested in disaster management. They're interested in disaster response. It also is a good way to network and learn about, what are your community's plans, and how do those community plans fit in with what you want to tell your patients and what you want to know yourself about how to respond to a disaster. Of course, I have to plug the AARC Disaster Response Roundtable. I am the chair of it. We've got about 120 members, and ideally, it's a great place to share information, to share resources, to ask and answer questions. Typically, there's a good core group of people in there that have a lot of knowledge, and it's typically within a day or so, if you ask a question, that you'll get an answer back to it, pointing to some decent resources. I would encourage, if you have interest in disaster response, or just learning a little bit more about things, to join that disaster response roundtable. And hey, it's free. You don't have to pay anything extra. We don't have a big convention, but we do try and keep updated information on there and share best practices. There's an awful lot of information about our friend Ebola, by the way, on there, which I hate saying that word these days, but I have to still say it. How else can you be involved? Be involved in local, regional planning committees. People don't necessarily know that we as RTs know what we know. So put yourself out there. and say, maybe you know somebody on your fire department, and you say, you know what, is there a local planning committee or somebody through your hospital? Because they're always looking for people. They're always looking for people to go to the meetings and to speak up and to provide input and expertise for their planning for whatever is going to befall the local community. And just like the MRC, it's a great place to network and a great place to learn about, what kind of activities are going on in our neighborhood. What kinds of things does the mayor, what does the mayor worry about? Should I be worrying about the same thing? And then really what it comes down to here is talking to your patients and having those face-to-face conversations with your patients, talking about the things that we're talking about here today, talking about where are you going to go, how are you going to get to a shelter, what's your best option? Is it to stay in place or is it to go away? Go home, go to a shelter. Talk to them about oxygen needs. Talk to them, make sure that their home care company isn't or is doing what they're supposed to do, and work with them to do that. I think most companies are reputable. I'm not going to ever say that they're not, but maybe somebody hasn't thought about this. Talk to them if they're on ventilators or they're going to be using other machines, about their medications, nebulizers, how those nebulizers are going to work, what happens if the power goes out. Is it something small enough, the nebulizer, that I can take it, or the patient can take it with them? It's almost like getting them ready to travel, but in an unplanned event. Talk to the patients about their need for sheltering. Do they know where shelters are? It might not be something that they're going to think about or their family's going to think about before they go home. But ideally, and I know as an RT, we spend a lot of time with our patients. And sometimes maybe there's not a lot to talk about. If there's a ball game on, sure, we can talk about the Mets. And I'm a Mets fan, I'm sorry to say. But use that time to talk about, hey, you're going to be going home on oxygen. Who's your home care company? And they say Brand X Home Care Company. Say, oh, good. Well, have you got written down all of their emergency contact information? Have you found out how quickly can they get to you if your power goes out and you need to bring you more cylinders? Questions like that. It's something that you can work into your conversations with your patients. It's not here you got to get prepared, watch Doomsday Preppers. No, but you can engage them because we are the experts about this stuff, even though we may not know it. Find out about special needs. Find out about medical shelters. If you're on your committee or you know somebody that's on your committee at the hospital, does the hospital, does a nursing home provide a sheltering? We talked about registries for local emergency services, fire department, EMS, police departments, county sheriff's departments, wherever that might live. Every state is different, every county is different, and there may be different procedures. But I think most places have some sort of a registry to know that Mrs. Smith is home and she's on oxygen, and if the power goes out, we need to either A, restore her power more quickly, or get her out into somewhere safe if she's in danger. Excuse me. Can also help with filling out forms. Of course, with any registry, with any of these things where you're trying to find things out, patients may need help filling in that registration form. What is it? They might have questions about the oxygen. How many liters am I on, or something like that. So you can assist them with that. It can be a good part of patient care. It can be a good conversation to have. If you're in a home care environment, I think it's even more important that you're aware of this and that you're aware of this with your patients. Now, COPD Foundation has a guide, which is they call their disaster preparedness plan. And I'm one of the co-authors of this. I suppose I could have told Shauna that in the beginning. But what we did is we tried to put together a guide that can be used by family members, that can be used by respiratory therapists in the hospital or in the home or really anywhere, and to address what some of these special needs are, what some of the specific needs for not only COPD patients but pulmonary patients in general. The nice thing about it is it's free. You can get it one of two ways. You can go to the website there, this www.copdfoundation.org, and click on the Educational Materials tab. You can download this as a PDF. It's in both English and Spanish. There's lots of pretty pictures. But there's also inside there some checklists. It may be difficult to see this up close, but there's a contact list, and there's what we call the stay kit. And we also have a list for a go kit. So when I talked about getting and building a kit, this is one of the lists that you can use. You can use it for yourself, you can use it for your patients to start to put a plan together for how you're going to respond. The contact list gives you a listing of, all police, fire, ambulance, your gas and electric utilities, pharmacies, physicians' offices, anything that you might think of that you would need to pull out and have and take with you if you needed to make phone calls, if you needed to contact people for help or for assistance. Within this guide, there's some sample letters that you can use for your physician to sign, so that basically it says that, yes, Mrs. Smith really is on oxygen and really needs to be on a registry and really could potentially need help during a disaster. The list in there is a stay or a shelter-in-place list. There's also one for having to go home, and go to a shelter. I'm going to back up one here, and then there's a second website there, which is the copd.oiondemand.com. And on that's their publication order form. And you do need to register, but it doesn't cost anything. And you can order as many of these guides, and there's a kit that goes along with it that has some loose leaf papers, as many as you want. If you are in a pulmonary rehab program, as in one of the hospitals I worked in, they had several of these that they would sit down and work with their patients. They'll send them to you. You have to pay shipping. That's the only thing you've got to pay. But it's a good visual way and a good reference to go through some of the things that I talked about here with your patients and for yourselves as well. Because if you're not ready for a disaster or a calamity, you certainly aren't going to be able to help your patients get ready. So we're getting near the end of my talking here. I've got a few web resources here listed. I'll leave them up there for a little bit. The COPD Foundation, as I mentioned, has a disaster preparedness plan. They also have an awful lot of resources just in general for COPD patients and pulmonary patients in general. If you're not familiar with them, it's really a very good organization, and they didn't pay me a dime to say that. So they're a top-notch group of people if you're not familiar with them. The federal government, believe it or not, has a lot of good information there for you at FEMA.gov, and they talk a lot about kits. They talk about older Americans. They talk about what can you do at work, what can you do at home. The CDC as well has a lot of good preparedness information. It's set up by problem, floods, that kind of thing, disease mostly. But it gives you some good, solid information there to use for planning or to use for facts or to get information to share with your patients or in between yourselves. And then the last is the AARC Connect, which is a great resource through the helpline, through any of the groups that you're a member or sections that you're a member of. I promote that because I just think it works really well. And you know, I feel that it's an important part of what I do. More resources. I think everybody's got a smartphone. I think if my grandmother was alive, she'd have a smartphone. So there's all kinds of apps. There's all kinds of widgets and apps and everything else. FEMA has several. Many states have emergency notification systems. I know most of the New England states do. Massachusetts does, and Connecticut. New York State does as well. And that can help you with your awareness of what's going on. And it'll alert and beep and tell you, you know, run inside, there's a storm coming. Things like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, hey, they're not just for kids anymore. A lot of federal agencies, the Weather Service, CDC, a lot of folks use, you know, use those social media outlets to provide good information, good and solid information. I haven't played much with Google+. I'm more of a Twitter freak. But there's also different weather apps. The Red Cross has an app series that you can go on and teach yourself how to respond to different things. You know, now we're getting done with winter, and you know, we're starting into the thunderstorm and tornado season. So it's not a bad idea for yourself to maybe research some of these apps and put them on your phone. It'll help alert you to what's going on and even to help you with your patients. So I think that's the last slide. And Shauna, we can open it up to questions, I think, if that's good.
Absolutely. We have a few, not a whole lot of questions just yet, so I have a couple of comments that I wanted to make and a couple questions of my own before I go to the chat area, so that'll give people who have questions an opportunity to type them in while I'm talking. One of the statements you made earlier in this session brought back a few memories of some things that maybe we don't think about as disasters, like you mentioned the railroad spills. When I was in college, a small town to the north of us had a railroad, an entire rail system fall over in transit, and it was carrying some hazardous waste. And so the evacuation of the town and you know, how much damage was done to the surrounding area, when it was safe to go back in, the hazmats and such was you know, a really big deal and lasted for a very long time. So there's, you know, when we think of disaster, I think we automatically go to the natural weather-related disasters versus these big things that happened. Someone posted wildfires, mudslides. In Texas, in our little area of Texas, we are just outside of Dallas. We've had an issue over the past, I guess it's been about a couple of months with earthquakes. We've had some series of earthquakes around here, and again, not something you think about when you think about Dallas and the kind of disasters that might befall us in this area. So one of the questions that I had for you is that we know that in an emergency situation, it is natural for people to flock to hospitals in emergency rooms, and especially our pulmonary patients. My power goes out, my water stops running, or whatever. my inclination is to go to the hospital because that's the safe place. How can the respiratory therapist help these patients prepare for that impulse? You know, what should we be telling our patients prior to these events to stop them from leaving the relative safety of their home and getting out into these dangerous situations?
I think just in finding out as an RT what is available in the community, and then passing that information on. If the community if you know that the community has an air-conditioned place with emergency power that can be used for special needs shelter, that you make sure to tell the patients that's the place to go first. And you're absolutely right. People do come to the hospitals. They come in, and we make plans for that as well. We've set aside areas in our hospitals here because even though we're the Northeast, we still do get some 100-degree temperatures, and not like Texas, of course. But so we set areas aside that are just that. They're just air-conditioned type shelters. But I think education of yourselves, of RTs and other medical people, to know what's available and where it is, and give that information to the patients so they know where to go.
So, do you, in your area, because obviously this is your realm of expertise in your geographic area, do you have a certain resource to which you look to find these potential resources, or would that kind of a response require calling around to various places in the community to determine what's going to be set up, what is set up, what's in the works, that type of thing?
We keep a resource list here at the hospital, so we know who is going to be setting up. Like, we know the Red Cross is going to be setting up shelters. We know who can set up special needs shelters. There's really not a great answer to that because there is so much variability around the country as to who takes responsibility for what. In some areas, the Red Cross will not set up a special needs shelter. In other areas, they will. Some areas, the county is very involved in the emergency planning along with the hospital and works in a cooperative manner. So for us, we make agreements. We have transfer agreements because we do get hit with patients that come in need of shelter. But one thing that has helped immensely is some of the information I said about the apps and about the alert systems and so on, where New York State's system can actually target areas and say let's say the city of Albany. If you need shelter in the city of Albany, go to and list those places out. So they're using technology to reach out and direct people really at the time of the calamity.
Great. I myself subscribe to a few of those apps in this area, which is always helpful for us regarding issues related to these earthquakes that we've been having around this area. So when you're helping your patients set up or prepare for a potential emergency, let's say we have a patient who has home oxygen supplied by a concentrator that needs electricity, or I have a home mechanically ventilated patient that obviously needs electricity. Do you encourage them to purchase surge protectors for the home medical equipment? Is that an issue at all?
I would frankly defer to the company, the home care company, in terms of surge protectors. I think the UPS's uninterruptible power supplies are actually a pretty decent way to go. They'll at least give some power until either a generator can be hooked up or it can be switched over to another device, especially in terms of, for oxygen. If you're in an area that gets a lot of thunderstorms and a lot of variability in your power, then I think Surge Protector probably is an excellent investment, most definitely.
Fantastic. I don't think we have any other questions. A lot of positive comments that this was a good topic to have as we go into especially the spring weather situation, tornado season in the spring. So hopefully everyone was able to get some really good tips on how to not only help themselves but also help their patients. One more question. I'm sorry, I overlooked it and now I see it. The pamphlets that you were talking with, do the home care companies typically have these pamphlets, or is this something that you would recommend the therapist, regardless of venue, regardless of where they work, what venue they work, should they have some on hand to distribute?
Again, I don't know about home care companies and and how involved they are. I think some are better than others. So my answer is, if you're thinking that you could provide these to your patients, then you should order some. You can get one or two for free, and if you're ordering several, again, you pay shipping. We used to keep several on hand at one of my old hospitals that I worked at, and gave out to our patients that were going home with oxygen. So we kind of took the lead on it. I think it's anywhere within the continuum is the place to do it, and I know that's the goal of the COPD Foundation, is to get these in the hands of people, no matter from where.
Thank you very much, Charlie. This has been a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and look forward to hopefully a calm year the rest of the year.
Amen. For those of you watching this as a live presentation, please stay with us during the next brief pause for instructions on how to obtain your CRCE contact hour. If you are watching this program as an archive, this concludes our presentation.